I joined an alien gym to get fit. Now my 13-foot trainer says I'm her warm-up partner. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Vale adjusted the straps of his duffel bag, sweat already forming under his collar as he stepped through the tinted glass doors of the crucible. The air inside smelled like metal, ozone, and something sharper, almost primal. A receptionist with 4 arms and a blank expression handed him a registration chip without a word. He pressed it to the back of his neck, and it clicked into place with a soft hiss. Information flooded his peripheral vision: training schedule, diet recommendations, muscle group diagnostics. But his eyes stopped on one flashing icon: trainer assigned. He tapped it. Xena Dravari, elite class, strength tier 9.9, status active. He raised an eyebrow. Most trainers fell in the tier 5-7 range. The fact that he got someone near a 10 meant one of two things: someone thought he could handle it, or someone wanted him dead. Either way, Vincent had been through worse: war zones, crashed escape pods, orbital drop malfunctions. His knees still clicked when he walked, but he hadn't come here to stay broken. He needed strength, power, purpose, even if he had to bleed for it. A side door opened with a loud hydraulic hiss, drawing the attention of half the gym. A giant silhouette filled the doorway, casting a shadow across the stretching mats. Crimson skin, glowing stripes across her shoulders and arms, heavy footfalls that made the floor panels hum. She wore what barely passed for a sports bra, dark tactical shorts, and a long towel slung across her shoulders like a cape. The woman, if she could even be called that, was massive, at least 13 ft tall, with fangs poking past her bottom lip and muscles that looked like they'd been carved from ship hull plating. Her tail coiled lazily behind her before it lashed and smacked a weight bench out of alignment. No one said a word. No one dared. Vincent stood his ground as she approached, though the logical part of his brain whispered that this was a mistake. She stopped in front of him, looked down, and narrowed her eyes. Her nostrils flared. Then, without a word, she struck. It wasn't a punch, more like a test, an open-palmed shove to the chest that sent him stumbling back a few feet into a rack of resistance bands. Pain bloomed across his sternum, but he didn't fall. He straightened up, rubbed the sore spot, and glared up at her. "I'm guessing that's a hello." Xena's lips curled, revealing sharper fangs. "You didn't fall? Good." Her voice was deep, gravel, and thunder. She turned her back to him and started walking toward the combat training zone. "Come, warm up." He followed, trying not to limp. His pride stung more than his chest. As he walked, he noticed how the other aliens made room for her, clearing paths without question. Some watched him with thinly veiled amusement, others with something closer to pity. One T-Zion, covered in quills and balancing on 6 legs, murmured something about the last human, and he couldn't help but wonder how many had failed this particular program. The training mat was matte black, surrounded by plasma barriers meant to absorb impacts. Xena stood in the center, arms folded, tail swishing side to side like a metronome. She tossed him a set of weighted gloves. They hit his chest hard, almost knocking the air from his lungs. "Stretch," she ordered. Vincent crouched low, rotating his shoulder and testing his joints. The gloves were heavy, far heavier than regulation Earth weights, but nothing he couldn't manage. He didn't complain. Instead, he mirrored her movements, watching the way her muscles flexed, how her tail acted like a third arm. She didn't just warm up, she coiled like a predator, eyes on him the whole time. He tried to lighten the mood. "You always knock new clients into the wall, or am I just lucky?" Xena paused mid-stretch and looked him over again, this time slower. There was a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "You're not lucky, you're alive." She lunged suddenly, no warning. He barely had time to dodge as her legs swept low. She wasn't trying to hurt him yet, but the speed and power in her movements made his instincts flare. He spun, ducked, and blocked a strike to his ribs, though it still rattled his spine. She pressed forward, unrelenting, testing his footwork, forcing him into reaction after reaction. No room to breathe, no room to think. After 5 brutal minutes, she stopped, breathing steady, while he collapsed to one knee, chest heaving. "Not bad," she said, circling him. "Not good, but not bad." "I'm not here to impress you," he growled, sweat dripping down his forehead. "I came to get strong again." Xena crouched beside him, tilting her head. Strength is earned, pain is the price. Her hand, twice the size of his, pressed against his shoulder, not hard, but with enough weight to remind him she could snap him in half if she wanted to. Most humans don't last a week. Their bones are soft, their minds weaker. I'm not most humans. Her eyes flashed with a strange light, the glowing stripes on her arms pulsing faster. She leaned closer, her breath hot against his cheek, and whispered, "Then prove it. Stretch with me, then mate with me." He blinked, not sure he heard her right. "Come again." She stood abruptly. "Dravari trained to test, mate to bond. Your performance will determine which." Vincent rubbed his temples. "Look, I'm not against some bonding, but maybe let's do one thing at a time." Xena let out a noise somewhere between a snort and a growl. "You joke. That means you're nervous. That means your heart is not ready." He pushed himself to his feet. "It means I prefer not to get flattened by a woman 3 times my size on the first day." For the first time, she actually laughed, low and short. "Good, then you'll survive the second." As he followed her back toward the main gym floor, Vincent noticed something different in her gait. Less hostility, a sliver of interest. She didn't look back at him, but she spoke over her shoulder. "You train with me now. You rest when you collapse and you stop when I say." Vincent's lips twisted into a tired grin. "Just like the Marines, except you smell like fire and sweat instead of cigarettes and cheap coffee." That earned him a tail slap to the thigh, light, almost playful. He yelped anyway. The Crucible wasn't just a gym. It was a proving ground and apparently also a battlefield for cross-species relationships. Vincent had no idea what he just signed up for, but his blood was pumping, his muscles were alive, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving forward. He didn't come here for romance. He came to get stronger. But judging by the way Xena's tail kept flicking back in his direction, he was going to get both whether he was ready or not. The next morning started before Vincent's internal clock even had the chance to register sunrise. His sleep had been brief, broken, and filled with the kind of muscle cramps that came from pushing your body too hard after a long break. His bunk at the dorms inside the Crucible was firm, clinical, and cold, fitting for a facility designed more for survival than comfort. He didn't complain. He knew better. Pain was just part of the process, and he'd lived through worse. Still, when the wake-up chime rang, his entire body groaned in rebellion. He rolled out of bed anyway, gritting his teeth as his legs tried to give out. Every tendon felt like it had been tightened a notch too far, and his right shoulder pulsed with a dull ache where Xena had slammed him during their warm-up. By the time he reached the gym floor, the place was already alive. Dozens of alien species in different training zones, some floating, others sprinting, others lifting machinery like dumbbells. But all that activity seemed to fade into the background when Xena stepped into view, already mid-set, bench pressing a grav sled designed for cargo. The weight indicator blinked red. Danger zone. Her arms flexed with terrifying control, crimson skin glistening under the high-powered lights. He didn't stop to gawk this time. He walked straight up to her, dropped his duffel beside the mat, and nodded once. Xena glanced at him, sweat dripping from her brow, and said nothing. She set the sled down with a metallic thud, sat up, and tossed him 2 small but dense spheres. He caught them, arms nearly giving out from the unexpected weight, weighted cores, training tech designed to force constant tension through muscle groups. He barely stayed standing. She seemed pleased. "You returned," she said, standing to her full height. "I thought you might sleep in or crawl back to Earth." Vincent rotated his sore shoulder, exhaling sharply. "I don't sleep in, I adapt. That's why I'm still alive." Xena smirked faintly, the smallest expression on her face carrying more meaning than a full speech from most. She turned and led him to the resistance lane, a narrow corridor lined with adjustable gravity walls and reactive drones. The moment they entered, the environment changed. Gravity increased by 15%, enough to drag his bones downward. Xena didn't even slow her stride. Vincent forced his legs to keep pace. The room's ceiling adjusted its lighting to simulate a rising alien sun, heat pumping into the space as part of the training protocol. Sweat broke out across his back before the session even began. Today's focus was coordination under duress. Xena explained it with one sentence before triggering the drones to attack. No countdown, no warning, just a sharp beep and they launched forward. The first drone targeted Vincent's head. He ducked, rolled, and threw one of the weighted cores into the path of another. It shattered on impact. The third tagged his shoulder with a minor sting, not enough to hurt, but enough to annoy. He bit back a curse and kept moving. Xena didn't step in to help. She simply observed, watching him like a predator evaluating prey, occasionally offering a single word of critique. Too slow. Better. Off balance. He went down hard on the fourth cycle, catching himself before he hit face first, arms trembling. Xena stepped closer but didn't offer a hand. Instead, she crouched and looked him dead in the eye. Why are you here, human? Vincent coughed once, pushed himself back onto his feet. Because I'm tired of being the guy with potential and nothing to show for it. Xena rose slowly, tail swaying. Then earn it. They trained for another hour. He failed more often than he succeeded, but each time he adjusted. His timing improved. His instincts sharpened. He didn't need her to baby him. He needed someone who would push him past what he thought he could take, and that was exactly what Xena did. She didn't explain her methods, didn't offer encouragement, but she also didn't dismiss him like most of the other aliens seemed to do. And that meant more than any words. After the session, they sat in the recovery chamber, a low-gravity environment meant to reduce pressure on the joints while the body cooled. Vincent floated just above the floor, his shirt clinging to him, lungs still trying to catch up to the air demand. Xena remained grounded, her weight too much for the chamber's lift field to handle. You fought with structure, she said eventually, eyes closed. Not emotion, that's rare among humans. Vincent looked over at her. I've had training, military ground forces pre-UF collapse. We weren't taught to fight angry, we were taught to fight smart. Strike where it hurts, survive. Xena opened her eyes. You fight to survive, I fight because it's what I am. You're a trainer, he said, eyebrows raised. Not a soldier. Her gaze didn't waver. I was a soldier before I became a trainer, a warrior before I was a soldier, and I will always be a fighter. That doesn't change. Vincent let that sit for a second. You don't get tired of it, always pushing, always breaking your limits. Xena's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but curiosity. Do you? He gave a half shrug. I came here to stop feeling like dead weight. I didn't expect to be tossed into a meat grinder of a workout with someone 3 times my size and twice my aggression. But here I am, not quitting. So no, I don't get tired of it. I get tired of not moving forward. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of the chamber. Then, surprisingly, Xena relaxed against the wall and let her head rest back. You think too much, but your answers are honest. He chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. That's probably the nicest thing anyone said to me since I got here. Her tail coiled near his foot, not touching but close enough for him to feel its heat. It wasn't aggressive, more like curious, testing boundaries. He didn't move away. I still don't understand your rituals, Xena said. You humans separate training from mating. Why? You prove yourselves in battle, in growth, in endurance, but then wait months to connect. Vincent raised an eyebrow. Because emotions are complicated, so are people. Back home, jumping into something physical without knowing someone usually ends in disaster. Dravari believe action defines intention. If I bleed for you, sweat beside you, fight with you, I already know you. The rest is unnecessary. He didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to laugh it off, but that wouldn't be fair. She wasn't flirting, not exactly. This was how she saw the world. He respected that. But the rawness of it, the honesty, it got under his skin in a way that made his pulse quicken. Then I guess we're still in your warm-up phase, he said finally. Xena tilted her head slightly. For now. The gravity in the chamber shifted, signaling cooldown was complete. As the doors hissed open, Vincent floated back to his feet and rolled his neck. Same time tomorrow. Xena stood without a word and walked past him. As she passed, her tail gently flicked his lower back, light enough to leave only heat. She didn't look back. Yes. Vincent's routine began to blur into something raw and focused. Morning started before his muscles were ready, and nights ended with him collapsing into bed, half alive, wondering how his bones hadn't shattered from the constant strain. But he kept showing up, and every time Xena was already there, waiting, not with a greeting, not with a nod of approval, but with another brutal session designed to wring out every weakness and crush it underfoot. He never asked her to go easy, and she never offered. There were no shortcuts, only pain, sweat, and progress measured in how long it took him to recover after being knocked flat. He didn't mind because he could feel it now, the strength returning, not the raw muscle, though that was coming too, but the mental edge, the discipline, the fire he thought he'd left behind when the war ended and the medals stopped meaning anything. Xena didn't care about his past. She only cared that he didn't quit. It was during a high-gravity deadlift drill that the shift finally happened. The station's gravity fields were dialed up to nearly double Earth standard, and Vincent's vision swam as he gripped the bar, arms shaking, back screaming. He'd been at it for half an hour, each rep worse than the last. Xena stood beside him, arms crossed, watching with that unreadable expression she always wore. She hadn't spoken since the drill started, not until he dropped the bar on the last lift and nearly buckled to the floor, teeth clenched so hard his jaw cracked. "Again," she said flatly. Vincent pushed himself upright, every part of him burning. "You want me to lift that again? It's already over max." She stepped forward, leaned close, and jabbed a clawed finger against his chest. "You speak like a man who doubts himself. Lift it or leave." Something in the tone made his blood surge. Not anger, something else. Defiance, pride. He wasn't sure, but he grit his teeth, wrapped his hands around the bar, and heaved. The weight rose, barely, but it rose. His legs locked, shoulders trembling until the rep completed. He dropped it with a loud clang and collapsed to a knee, panting hard, every nerve screaming. Xena crouched beside him, silent for a moment. Then she reached out and pressed her palm to his chest. It wasn't a healing touch. It wasn't romantic. But there was something grounding in the contact, solid, warm, heavy, like she was trying to feel the heartbeat beneath his ribs. "You hate being weak," she said quietly. Vincent didn't argue. "Yeah, I do." "You aren't," she said. He met her gaze, and for a brief moment there was no noise, no machines, no other bodies training in the distance. Just her and him breathing the same air, connected by pain and willpower. He didn't know if she understood what her words meant to him, how many times he'd replayed old failures in his head, how many nights he'd stared at his reflection and wondered what was left. But somehow she did. Maybe not in the way a human would, but in her own way. Xena didn't coddle, she didn't lie. If she said he wasn't weak, it was because she believed it. Later, after the recovery chamber and a silent walk back toward the dorms, Xena took a different turn and gestured for him to follow. He didn't hesitate. She led him through one of the side corridors not on his map, down into a deeper level of the station that smelled of oiled metal and ionized air. Eventually, they reached a circular room lined with worn mats and scarred pillars. It wasn't part of the public gym. It was older, less maintained, a private training zone. "This is where Dravari warriors test bonds," she said. "Fighting, sparring, close quarters, trust is forged here." Vincent stepped inside and looked around. "So, what, you brought me here for extra punishment?" Xena smirked, faint but unmistakable. "No, I brought you here because you keep standing. That deserves something more." Before he could respond, she tossed him a padded combat vest and stepped into the center of the room. "We spar, full contact. No timers, no rules, first to make the other submit wins." He slipped on the vest, ignoring how his body ached and rolled his neck. "You sure you want to do this? I might embarrass myself." "If you do," she said, lowering into a stance, "you will learn." The fight began without ceremony. Xena moved fast, faster than she ever had during drills, forcing Vincent to react on instinct. He ducked her first swipe, countered with a knee to her side, and rolled away before she could slam him into the mat. They circled, exchanged blows, sweat flying in every direction. He landed hits that made her grunt, and she returned them with strikes that sent shock waves through his spine. But there was a rhythm to it, a dance born of mutual understanding. Neither of them was trying to destroy the other. They were testing limits, trusting the other not to cross lines, even when fists flew. Eventually, after a brutal takedown that ended with Vincent pinned beneath her, gasping, they both froze. Her body loomed over his, massive and warm, chest rising and falling just inches from his face. Her hands pinned his wrists and her tail curled around one of his ankles, not tight but firmly enough to remind him who had control. But her eyes weren't mocking. They were calm, focused. "You lasted longer than most warriors," she said. "You didn't surrender." "I didn't win either," he said, chest heaving. "Winning is not always the goal," she replied. "Sometimes surviving is enough." She released him slowly, rising to her feet and offering a hand. He took it and she pulled him up with ease. There was something unspoken between them now, a shift. They weren't just trainer and trainee anymore, they were partners in pain, in grit, in growth. And beneath all of that, something deeper stirred, something neither of them acknowledged yet. They stood in silence for a while, sweat dripping from their bodies, steam rising in the cool air. Eventually, Vincent cleared his throat. "So, was that your version of a date?" Zena's eyes narrowed, but her mouth twitched again. "If it was, you're a terrible romantic." "I'll take that as a compliment," he said, grabbing his towel and slinging it over his shoulder. "Same time tomorrow." Zena didn't answer right away. She walked past him, tail flicking just behind his back again, slower this time. When she reached the door, she turned slightly and looked over her shoulder. "Yes, but tomorrow you lead." The next day hit different. Vincent didn't walk into the gym like a newbie anymore. The soreness in his limbs still lingered, but it had transformed from debilitating pain to something else. Reminder of progress, proof that each brutal rep, each punishing drill, was chiseling away at everything soft in him. His gait had more weight to it now, not just from the added muscle, but from the way people moved around him. Aliens who had once stared at him like an amusement now gave him space, not out of fear. He wasn't terrifying like Xena, but out of recognition, respect. He had earned that, and it fueled something inside him that had been dormant for too long. Pride, maybe, the good kind, not arrogance, just the quiet, satisfying knowledge that he was becoming something again, something better. Xena was already in the combat zone, flipping a massive weighted slab with the ease of a woman tossing a couch cushion. She didn't greet him, she never did, but when she looked up and saw him entering, something passed between them. A nod, slight, subtle, but it said everything. He'd shown up again, that mattered. "You lead," she said, tossing a wrapped bundle at his feet. Vincent crouched and unwrapped it. Inside were hand wraps, a modified shock baton, and an old-school analog stopwatch. The baton was clearly meant for mixed-species drills, enough voltage to sting without real damage, a favorite in advanced reflex training. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his hands, set the stopwatch, and held up the baton. "Obstacle gauntlet," he said. 2 laps, no gravity assist. If I finish under 10, I call the next drill. If I don't, you do." Zena's lips parted slightly, the closest he'd seen her come to impressed. She didn't argue. Instead, she stalked over to the start pad and planted her feet like she was ready to charge into battle. Vincent hit the timer and went. The gauntlet was designed for alien bodies, too tall, too wide, too unpredictable. But that didn't matter. He launched himself into the first series of wall runs, bouncing between slippery panels as gravity fluxed. His timing wasn't perfect, but he adjusted, using momentum instead of brute force. The floating platforms in the middle nearly tripped him, and one of the suspended wire traps grazed his shoulder, leaving a thin burn mark across his skin. But he didn't slow down. He remembered Xena's voice. "You stop when I say," and used it like fuel. By the time he dropped down the final ramp and slammed into the ground, the stopwatch read 9:44. Not clean, not graceful, but under the mark. He stood panting, wiped his mouth, and turned to Xena. "Your turn." She stepped into the starting line, and for the first time, Vincent saw her falter. Not physically, she didn't show weakness like that, but her eyes lingered on him a second longer than usual. He realized then that this wasn't about her doubting the course, it was her acknowledging his growth. He'd come in broken, limping, barely able to lift half the weight she could carry with one hand. Now he was leading her through drills. She respected that. She ran it faster than him, of course, 8 minutes flat. But that wasn't the point. The baton in his hand meant he chose the next drill, and he didn't hesitate. Reaction sparring. No holds, no prediction. First one to land 5 clean strikes. She gave a slow nod, rolled her neck, and entered the ring. What followed wasn't just a fight, it was an exchange of willpower. Each move she threw came from years of battle experience, instinct honed through countless victories. But Vincent didn't fight her like a scared underdog anymore. He fought her like a rival. Their strikes collided midair, grunts filled the space, and the force of their clashes echoed through the training zone. He landed the first 2 hits with clean baton strikes to her thigh and side. She countered with 3 fast blows to his ribs, hip, and wrist, each hit staggering but not enough to drop him. It came down to the final point. They stood in the center of the ring, both dripping sweat, panting, blood pounding in their ears. Vincent feinted left, saw her tail twitch, and spun low, catching her ankle with the baton in a sweeping arc that knocked her slightly off balance. She didn't fall, but she slipped just enough for him to land a final jab across her midsection. "5," he gasped. "That's 5. Xena looked down at the spot he tagged, then back up at him. Her breathing was heavy now, not from exertion, but something more. She didn't move. Neither did he. For a long stretch of silence, they just stared at each other across the ring, tension curling. Then she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and reached out. Her hand settled on his chest again, palm pressing against his sternum. "You've changed," she said softly, voice lower than usual. Vincent didn't flinch. "So have you." Xena tilted her head, her glowing stripes dimming slightly, as if she was trying to hide something behind that thick wall of discipline and control. "Dravari do not form bonds easily. We don't seek comfort. We test. We challenge. But when we find someone strong enough to match us, we remember them forever." He felt his heart pounding beneath her hand. "And am I matching you now?" She didn't answer, not in words. Instead, she stepped closer until he could feel the heat of her body all along his front. Her tail coiled slowly behind him, not touching but close. Very close. "I feel your scent on me," she said. "After each fight, even after I clean myself, it lingers, you stay." His breath caught for a second, but he didn't back away. "That doesn't bother you." "It means you're becoming part of me," she said. "I don't know what that means yet, but I don't want it to stop." He let that hang there, heavy and honest, before finally replying. "I didn't come here looking for anyone, just wanted to fix myself. But you make me want more." Xena's eyes flashed. Her hand slid from his chest down to his waist, not possessive but firm. "Then stay close, because the trials only get harder from here." Vincent nodded once. "I'm not going anywhere." She released him, stepped back, and without another word, turned and walked away, tail sweeping behind her with the lazy confidence of someone who'd made a choice and expected him to keep up. He stood there for a moment longer, heartbeat finally slowing, mind reeling from the shift in energy between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real. And in this place, where strength was the only language, it spoke louder than any promise. It was after their 5th consecutive week of relentless training, during a lull in one of the simulated gravity chambers, that Vincent started to notice something off, not with himself, but around him. It wasn't anything dramatic. It started small. The gym drones began hovering near him longer than usual, their cameras twitching slightly in his direction during cooldown routines. One of the biometric scan stations refused his identification twice in a row before suddenly accepting it. And during a protein intake session at the commissary, he caught a group of maintenance workers glancing over at him and whispering, only to fall silent when he looked up. Xena didn't acknowledge any of it. She remained focused, consistent, brutal in her methods, but more attentive than before. She noticed things even if she didn't say them aloud. And the deeper into this schedule they pushed, the more Vincent felt like something was happening behind the scenes, not just between the two of them, but around them. During that day's post-training session, Vincent sat in the recovery pod, his muscles trembling after being subjected to a shock-resistant circuit Xena had designed herself, something involving electrons and underwater grappling dummies. He leaned back against the wall of the pod, catching his breath, while Xena stood outside the chamber, arms crossed, silent as always. But her eyes were not on him. They were fixed on a nearby observation terminal. Unusual, she wasn't the type to get distracted. "Something wrong?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Xena didn't look at him. That terminal was not active earlier. It should not be accessing combat logs. Vincent sat up straighter. Combat logs, you mean our sessions? She turned, narrowed her eyes slightly. This facility is monitored, yes, but not like this, not this frequently, not with direct uplinks during closed sessions. Think someone's watching us? I don't think, she said flatly. I know. Her tone didn't carry fear. Xena didn't seem like the type to get rattled, but it had edge, and that was rare. Vincent stood, rolling his shoulder with a grimace. Any idea who? She hesitated, then finally said, the Crucible's founders are not just training experts. They are part of a larger collective, a research branch testing interspecies compatibility, aggression suppression, biomechanical enhancement through stress conditioning. They monitor anomalies. You are an anomaly. Vincent stared at her. Wait, you knew this? You knew I was part of some experiment? Her jaw tightened. I suspected, but suspicion is not proof until now. He took a breath, tried to rein in the frustration building under his skin. So I'm a lab rat? That what this is? You being my trainer wasn't random, was it? No pairing is random, she admitted. But I chose to push you, not for them, for me. That landed differently. The fire in his gut didn't cool entirely, but her honesty dulled the sharpest part of it. Why me? He asked, voice low. Xena stepped closer. Because you fight back, you adapt. I do not waste effort on the weak. You were placed here to be observed, measured, but you've become more than their data. It didn't erase the truth, but it made it sting less. Still, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that he had been led into something without consent. It wasn't just training anymore. It never had been. His progress, their bond, the way the gym seemed to center around their sessions more and more. It was all part of a bigger system designed to monitor how far a human could go when paired with a warrior like Xena. But unlike so many other manipulative programs he'd seen in the military, this one hadn't broken him. It had sharpened him, and a big part of that was because of her. Later that evening, Vincent returned to the dorms, but sleep didn't come. His thoughts swirled too loud. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the digital wall display running diagnostics on his own biometrics. His strength had increased by nearly 30%. Reflex speed had doubled. Endurance tests showed off-the-charts growth. Some of that was training, some of it was his own grit, but part of him began to suspect something else. Something was accelerating all of it. He made his way back through the quiet halls, past the security sectors, and toward the restricted gym zones. He knew the risk, unauthorized access could get him booted from the program, but he needed answers. The doors didn't stop him. His credentials were still live, too live, actually. No error screens, no resistance. It was as if the system expected him. He found what he was looking for in a lower data vault, a place lined with transparent cases of recovered exosuits, cracked helmets, even weaponized AI cores. But tucked behind the storage chamber was a terminal, still logged in under an admin account. It only took a few taps to pull up his profile. Project Vantage, Human Adaptive Response Model 11B Paired Subject, Xena of the Dravari Elite. Compatibility ranking, Tier Prime. Notes, unpredictable neural elasticity. Responds favorably to extreme physical duress when exposed to Dravari bond cues. Potential for long-term integration high. Vincent backed away from the screen slowly, everything clicking into place. His bond with Xena, the odd flashes of energy, the quick physical recovery, the instincts kicking in faster than ever before. It wasn't just training chemistry. It was engineered, triggered, maybe even manipulated. But then, at the very bottom of the page, in a section marked Override Logs, he saw something that stopped him cold. Manual override. Xena refused stimulant injections, refused behavioral suppressors, all subject interactions conducted under natural parameters. She hadn't cheated, she hadn't used enhancements or mind tricks, she hadn't followed their protocol, she had done it her way. He exhaled hard. Whatever the higher-ups wanted, whatever they were tracking, Xena had shielded him from the worst of it. She trained him like a warrior, not like a lab sample. And that mattered. It mattered more than anything else in that room. When he turned to leave, two figures stepped into the hall. Human-shaped security. Their visors blinked red. One of them held a stun rod. "You're not authorized to be down here," the taller one said. "You violated protocol." Vincent didn't move. "You want to explain why I'm being used as a test subject without consent first." The second one stepped forward. "Don't make this worse than it needs to be." Before either of them could grab him, the ceiling above cracked with a heavy thud. A shadow dropped between them, a blur of crimson and muscle. Xena landed in a crouch, her presence cutting through the tension like a blade. Her eyes glowed faintly, her breathing calm. "You touch him," she said, voice low, "and I break you." The guards hesitated, then backed away slowly, hands raised. Xena didn't chase. She waited until they were gone before turning to Vincent. "I warned you." He shook his head. "I had to know." She didn't argue, just walked past him, her steps echoing against the walls. "Then you know, whatever they planned, they failed. You are not theirs." Vincent looked after her, chest still heaving, adrenaline still high. "No," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'm yours." Xena didn't speak the rest of the night, and Vincent didn't press her. She led him through a maze of back corridors and disused maintenance shafts until they emerged into an auxiliary training dome long since abandoned. No security feeds, no monitoring drones, just ancient workout machines covered in dust and rust. This place wasn't on any map, and judging by the way her eyes scanned the shadows, even she wasn't entirely sure if it was still safe. But she brought him here anyway. That meant something. The air inside was dry and thick, stale from disuse. But it wasn't the kind of place that bred fear. It felt more like a sanctuary. Xena crouched near one of the old med benches and began sharpening the edge of a combat blade she'd pulled from a hidden compartment in her training belt. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filled the silence while Vincent sat against the far wall, trying to process the mess they were in. The crucible had been his chance to restart his life. Now it was a trap, a cage designed to turn him into a product, and maybe it would have worked if Xena hadn't thrown their plan off course. She wasn't just his trainer. She'd been protecting him from the moment they met, when she slammed him into that wall, when she made him bleed, when she made him strong. Every blow she delivered had been a lesson. Every moment of silence had meant she was thinking, calculating, watching for threats, not just from outsiders, but from the very people who ran this place. He finally understood what kind of pressure she was under, having to serve as both shield and weapon at once. It wasn't about romance anymore, not just that. What they had was loyalty forged through fire. And maybe, buried under all that intensity, there was something more growing between them. But right now, it was survival first. "You didn't have to come for me," Vincent said after a long while, his voice rough from exhaustion but steady. "You could have let them drag me off. That would have been the easier move." Xena didn't look up, she kept sharpening. "Easier does not mean better." He watched her a moment longer, then shook his head. "You knew they'd target me eventually. How long were you planning to keep this hidden?" "I wasn't," she said, blade glinting in the dim light. "I was waiting." "For what?" "For you to be strong enough to stand beside me instead of behind me." That shut him up for a second. She didn't say things like that often, if ever. When she finally looked at him, her eyes weren't glowing with rage or adrenaline this time. They were calm, measured, but still fierce. "They picked you because you were breakable," she said. "But you didn't break, you adapted, you resisted, you changed. That's why I stopped following their protocol. That's why I ignored the chemical directives. You were never just a subject, you were a challenge. Now you're something more." Vincent stood, the ache in his legs a dull roar now. "So what happens now? We can't just hide out in the basement forever. They'll come for us again." Xena nodded. "They will, but we're not waiting this time." "What does that mean?" She gestured toward the rack of ancient weapons against the wall, none of them cutting edge, but all of them real. Not training replicas, not foam-padded toys, tools for war. "It means we fight." Vincent stared at the gear at her, then back again. "You sure about this?" "I'm Dravari, we don't run." He took a breath, rubbed the back of his neck. "Right, of course." They spent the next 2 hours preparing. Vincent practiced grip forms with a weighted baton while Xena calibrated an old pulse blade she claimed once belonged to a gladiator. The training dome became their staging ground. They mapped out weak points in the crucible's internal structure, old maintenance tunnels, hidden blind spots, unsecured power nodes. Xena knew the layout better than any AI, and Vincent realized just how long she must have been preparing for this. She hadn't been blind to the program. She'd been walking through it with her eyes wide open, biding her time. Now, with Vincent fully grown into the fighter she knew he could be, she was ready to strike. As they reviewed the last route, Xena turned to him, unusually still. "There's something else you should know." Vincent tensed. "Let me guess, there's more." "They've tagged your DNA," she said. "You've bonded with me biologically." His heart kicked against his ribs. "What does that mean?" "Our training together, our proximity, it's triggered a response. Dravari physiology adapts when we're exposed to a compatible mate over time. Your body's mimicking mine. Strength, resilience, reaction time. It's why your recovery's been so fast." He felt the floor sway beneath him, not because he was afraid, but because it explained everything. The way he kept bouncing back, the subtle changes, the way he'd started picking up on her movements almost before she made them. "You said bonded, past tense." Xena didn't flinch. "Because the process is complete. You are mine, whether you acknowledge it or not." Vincent looked her in the eyes and didn't look away. "And you, are you mine?" She stared at him a long moment, then stepped close. Close enough for him to feel her heat. Close enough for her hand to rest against his chest like it had before. "Yes," she said, voice low, solid. "I chose you, not because of the program, not because of your stats, because you kept getting up." He didn't answer. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't gentle. It was the raw kind of kiss that came from two people who had bled and grown and fought together. Her mouth was hot, rougher than any human's, and her fangs grazed his lip. But she didn't pull away. She met him with the same energy, matching his intensity, letting it crash between them like a final wall breaking down. When they parted, her hand was still on his chest. His forehead rested against hers. "Tomorrow," he said, "we take back our future." Xena smiled, just barely. "Tomorrow," she agreed. And somewhere in the dark corridors of the crucible, the sensors blinked to life, tracking their vitals again, watching, waiting. But this time they weren't alone, and they weren't unprepared. The next morning wasn't marked by alarms or the buzz of machinery. It began with silence, the kind that clings to the walls before a storm breaks. Vincent woke on the floor of the old dome beside Xena, his back sore, his pulse steady. She hadn't slept, or if she had, it was the kind of meditative trance her species used instead of rest. She stood at the far end of the room, already armored, her back to him, performing a slow series of stretches that looked more like combat movements than anything related to limbering up. Her muscles coiled and released with perfect rhythm, each motion reminding him of the power she wielded and the discipline that held it in check. He stood quietly, pulling his gear on, his own body moving with less strain than expected. Even after everything, he felt sharp, clear. The connection between them wasn't just emotional, it was biological now. Her instincts, her energy, even her subtle cues had begun integrating into him like muscle memory. It wasn't just a bond, it was evolution. They didn't speak much while preparing. There was no need. The plan had already been outlined the night before. Move through the old maintenance tunnels beneath the south wing. Reach the data control hub on level B-17. Expose the Crucible's hidden experiment protocols to the public network. Once those files hit the open grid, there'd be no going back. Xena had quietly leaked fragments of data before, but always too little to make a difference. This time would be different. This time, they'd blow the lid off the entire operation, and if the Crucible tried to stop them, they'd hit back hard. Their first obstacle was a wall-mounted security turret nestled into the tunnel's curve, blinking with dormant menace. Xena approached it head-on, counting on her armor to absorb the first burst. But Vincent darted ahead, taking a side path through a utility crawl space and cutting the turret's targeting system from behind. She didn't scold him. She only nodded once, acknowledging the initiative. The Crucible had trained him to be reactive. Xena had taught him to lead. It made him dangerous now. They reached the B-level sector an hour later, the climb through the vertical access shaft leaving them both drenched in sweat. Vincent kept his pulse steady as they emerged into a darkened storage wing lined with defunct server racks and old tech cases. The data hub was just past it, behind a reinforced security door guarded by two sentinels. One human, one Tari, both fully armored and armed. Xena looked to Vincent, her expression unreadable but alert. This part couldn't be avoided. There would be no sneaking past. It was confrontation or failure. Vincent didn't wait for a signal. He moved fast and silent, drawing his baton from its back slot and slamming it into the human guard's knee from behind. The armor resisted, but the force and angle were enough to drop him. The Tari turned with a hiss, its forearms raised, but Xena was already in the air, leaping from a running crouch into a spinning kick that shattered the guard's upper torso plate. They finished it together, efficient, clean, decisive. Inside the data hub, the light pulsed a cool blue. Rows of panels glowed faintly, and the terminals Xena had marked on their schematic stood out like a beacon. Vincent moved to it, pulling out the transfer chip they'd preloaded with the incriminating files, project records, genetic pairing data, unauthorized hormonal influence logs, even internal memos about replacing uncooperative subjects. One of them had his name. Another had Xena's. The Crucible wasn't just manipulating individuals. It was building a blueprint for controlling them, for turning biological bonds into programmable outcomes. He inserted the chip and began the upload. It was faster than expected. Either no one was watching this sector anymore, or they were being allowed to succeed. He wasn't sure which possibility was worse. Xena stood at the entrance, her stance alert, her eyes scanning for movement. She didn't speak, but Vincent could feel her tension. He could feel everything about her now, her readiness, her restrained aggression, her desire to protect, to fight, to finish what they'd started. 15%, he said, eyes on the screen. She gave a short nod but didn't turn. Then movement, far end of the hall, the air shifted. A low hum began to rise, not mechanical but biological. Something heavy approached, not guards, not drones, something worse. They came in clusters, hybrids, combat clones with spliced Dravari DNA, human neural tech and crucible programming, prototypes. Xena's jaw tensed. They were holding them in reserve. We were the test, they are the product. Vincent's fingers flew across the console. 50%. The hybrids didn't hesitate. They charged, all muscle and claws and blank-eyed fury. Xena met them first, her roar echoing off the steel. She moved like a storm, striking with precision and rage. For everyone she took down, another surged forward. Vincent grabbed the shock baton, spun, and caught a hybrid trying to flank her. The thing didn't flinch when hit. It just snarled and pressed harder. He jammed the baton into its ribs and kept the charge running until it dropped. More came, 5, then 10, then more. 70%, he called. Xena was bleeding now, not badly, but the crimson smear on her thigh told him the fight wasn't clean anymore. He got to her side and backed her up, swinging, ducking claws, smashing knees. They fought as one, covering gaps, turning together, moving in rhythm. The bond between them wasn't metaphor anymore. It was real. They could feel each other's movement before it happened. 85%, Xena growled, her tail lashing out, impaling a hybrid through the gut and lifting it from the ground. Another leapt at Vincent, claws aimed for his throat. He dropped low, rolled under, and brought the baton up in a savage strike that shattered the hybrid's jaw. 93%. Xena grabbed the last two hybrids, slammed their heads together with enough force to crack the walls, and stumbled back. Vincent caught her. The console chimed. "Upload complete," he said. "We did it." Xena didn't smile. She just exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Then they know, all of them." He helped her to her feet. The air felt different now, like they'd broken something too big to put back together. "What happens now?" Vincent asked, wiping blood from his forehead. Xena looked down at him, her hand curling around his arm. "Now we survive the fallout." They stood amid the carnage, surrounded by silence and blinking lights. No alarms, no backup, just them and the truth unleashed. And in the center of it all, Xena leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, not in a kiss, not this time, but in the Dravari way. A promise. A vow shared between equals. They hadn't won yet, but they weren't running anymore. The corridors of the Crucible were quiet in the worst possible way. After the upload, after the battle with the hybrids, everything had gone still, not the calm of safety, but the pause before retaliation. Vincent and Xena moved cautiously through the underbelly of the facility, both of them bloodied, bruised, but alive. No alarms rang, no guards pursued. That alone made Vincent uneasy. He had seen what real panic looked like, systems scrambling to contain a threat, forces mobilizing, orders flying. This wasn't that. This was something colder, smarter. Somewhere, someone was watching everything they did and making a decision. Xena walked with a slight limp now. The gash along her thigh had clotted, but it still slowed her movement. She never complained, never asked for help. She just moved forward, scanning corners, keeping her claws half-drawn. Vincent stayed close, matching her pace, baton still in hand. His body was burning, not just from exhaustion, but from the residual high of battle. Every cell in him felt wired for survival, for motion, like the adrenaline didn't know the fight was over. But he kept his breathing steady and his focus tight. He could break down later, not now. They reached a service lift hidden behind a wall panel that Xena pried open with her bare hands. The shaft dropped straight down to the gladiatorial floors, an area once used for training elite Dravari fighters and more recently converted into display matches for high-value trainees. It wasn't in use now, but Xena insisted they go there. It was the only place left in the facility not monitored through the central AI grid. Analog, disconnected, ignored. That made it safe, or as safe as anywhere could be. The ride down was silent. The lift creaked, powered by an old magnetic chain. Xena leaned against the wall, her face hard, jaw tight. Vincent watched her, studying the lines of stress around her eyes. She fought through hell without hesitation, risked everything to get him out alive. And now, even bleeding, even hunted, she remained composed. He wasn't sure if it was pride or fury that kept her so locked in, but whatever it was, it reminded him why she had earned his respect long before she'd earned his heart. When they reached the bottom level, the doors opened to reveal an empty chamber bathed in low red light. The combat ring was still intact, an octagonal arena surrounded by worn-out seats and reinforced viewing glass. Xena walked into the center of the ring without hesitation and dropped to one knee, not out of weakness. It was something ritualistic. She pressed her palm to the cracked tile and stayed still. Vincent stepped beside her, lowering his voice. "What is this?" She didn't look at him. Dravari tradition. When a warrior is betrayed, they return to the place where they first bled in service. They kneel to reclaim their strength. He let that sink in, then nodded. "And this is where you trained." She finally met his eyes. "This is where I became a weapon." Vincent crouched beside her, not speaking for a moment. "You're not a weapon anymore." Xena didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than usual. "You weren't supposed to last. They matched you to me to prove humans couldn't endure, to make me fold. But you didn't break, you grew, and I didn't fold, I changed." "You think they're still coming?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "They're deciding how," she said, "and when." He exhaled and rubbed a hand down his face. "So what do we do?" "We make them come to us." That sentence came with finality, not bravado, a decision. She stood, turned toward the old observation deck, and began dragging one of the heavy crates into the center of the arena. Vincent helped, though he didn't understand why, until she pulled out a thermal flare pack and tossed one directly into the air. It shot up, exploded in a burst of light, and flooded the chamber in red pulses. It was a beacon, an announcement. "You're calling them down here." Xena looked over her shoulder, a glint in her eyes. "They wanted to try." Minutes passed. Then a voice crackled over the outdated speaker system, gravelly, distorted by decades of disuse, but still intelligible. "Xena Carr, Subject Vincent Vale. Stand down. This facility is now under emergency lockdown. You are surrounded." Vincent barked a laugh. "Surrounded doesn't feel like it." Xena raised her voice toward the ceiling. "If you wanted us dead, you'd have done it already. Send your best, or don't send anyone at all." Silence followed. Then the doors opened. 3 figures entered, not hybrids, not guards, trainers. The top-tier ones, the kind Vincent had seen once or twice from a distance and assumed were legends. One was a 4-armed avix with retractable bone blades. The second was a massive brute with chrome skin and artificial ligaments flexing beneath translucent armor. The last looked human, but the way she moved said otherwise, controlled, fluid, expressionless. Xena stepped forward into the ring. This is their final test. If we fall, the data dies with us. If we stand, the truth leaves this station. Vincent joined her without hesitation. The fight began fast. The Avix lunged first, spinning blades flashing. Vincent caught one strike with his baton, deflected another, and ducked under the third. Xena intercepted the fourth blade mid-swing and twisted it until the arm snapped backward. The brute moved next, fists like sledgehammers. Vincent rolled left then right, trying to avoid the weight behind the strikes, but one caught him in the ribs and threw him against the arena wall. He wheezed, staggered up, and dove back into the fray. Xena held her ground against the human-looking one. Their strikes were even precise, almost like choreography. She wasn't just fighting a trainer. She was fighting someone trained in her own style, a mirror. It made every blow slower, heavier. She couldn't predict her opponent's next move because it was her own. Vincent came in from the side and cracked his baton against the humanoid's temple, disrupting her rhythm. Xena followed up with a spine-shattering kick that sent the woman flying. The Avix screeched and leapt, but Vincent anticipated the angle this time and drove his baton into the joint where the blades connected. One arm snapped, then another. The brute charged, roaring. Xena didn't wait. She met him head-on. When they collided, the whole chamber shook. Vincent sprinted to help, but Xena was already climbing the brute's back, driving her claws into its synthetic joints, tearing apart plating until it collapsed to one knee. Vincent hit it with the baton once, twice, then a final third time that short-circuited its system. Silence fell again. The three elite trainers were down. Vincent stood over one, chest heaving. "That your best?" The speaker crackled once more. "Transmission has reached public net. External eyes now on Crucible. Shutdown initiated. This facility will self-neutralize in 5 minutes." Xena looked at Vincent. Time to go. They left the arena as alarms finally began to wail, not because of them, but because exposure meant destruction. The Crucible couldn't afford to exist anymore, not with the truth out. As they ran through collapsing corridors and buckling lights, Vincent glanced over at her. "You think this is over?" She smirked. "No, this is the beginning." The station was dying from the inside out. Vincent could feel it with every step. Panels overheating, warning sirens echoing through cracked walls, steam venting through damaged pipes like the Crucible itself was exhaling its last breath. Lights flickered as backup systems failed, and the massive structure began its slow collapse, not through fire or explosions, but through systematic shutdown, the kind that wasn't meant to be survived. Every door they passed autolocked behind them, hatches sealed. Access points became dead ends. It was a protocol meant to trap whatever threat had been identified, and right now that threat was them. Xena moved ahead with grim efficiency, limping slightly but refusing to slow down. Her body, despite the damage, moved like a war machine, grace and power in equal measure. Vincent followed close behind, his baton still gripped in one hand, other arm wrapped tight across his bruised ribs. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, and in its place came pain, steady and growing, but he ignored it. Pain meant he was still alive. So was she. That was all that mattered. They reached the northern access shaft, an emergency maintenance shaft barely wide enough for a single Dravari. Xena slammed her palm against the panel beside it, and the wall groaned as the entry lock disengaged with a hiss. The shaft led upward, 5 levels of handholds, exposed pipes, and narrow footing. A straight climb into a part of the station that hadn't been fully digitized yet. Manual systems, off-grid. That's where they had to go. They couldn't escape through the normal exit routes. Those would already be sealed or crawling with containment teams. If they wanted out, they had to go through the old paths, parts of the Crucible that were half forgotten, obsolete, and considered irrelevant. That made them perfect. Xena climbed first, moving like the pain in her leg didn't exist. She didn't hesitate. Vincent followed, every pull of his arm sending shocks through his side. Blood had soaked through his shirt now, warm and sticky, but it wasn't deep, just messy. Every few meters, he glanced up and saw her tail swaying slightly with her movements, helping balance her as she ascended. He wondered if she even realized she was slowing her pace to match his. She never said anything, but he knew she could have outclimbed him in half the time, injuries or not. But she didn't leave him behind. When they finally reached the top, they collapsed against a rusted maintenance panel, catching their breath in the dark. The air was thinner here, less filtered. The emergency ventilation hadn't reached this level in years. Dust clung to everything. But there was no alarm, no security drones, no sensors sweeping the corridors. It was quiet, peaceful in the way that broken places sometimes are. Xena turned to him, her face serious. This level leads to an external maintenance bay. There should be an escape rig if the Crucible hasn't scavenged it yet. Vincent nodded. You ever been up here before? Once, she said. During my first cycle, I climbed up here to escape punishment. It was the only time I ever hid from a fight. He looked at her surprised. Why'd you come back? Because hiding didn't fix anything, she said. Only fighting did. They moved together down the corridor, Xena ahead checking corners, Vincent close behind, baton ready. The deeper they went, the more the facility seemed to forget itself. Doors sagging off hinges, walls covered in markings from previous inhabitants, old gear left behind like fossils. This was a graveyard of forgotten experiments, buried memories. Vincent saw faded names on the walls, other trainees, probably ones who never made it through the program. It hit him harder than he expected. These weren't just victims of bad luck. They were test subjects like him, and no one ever told their story, until now. The escape rig was where she said it would be, tucked in a storage dock behind a wall of old lockers. It wasn't much to look at, a compact single-pilot exopod with minimal thrusters and barely enough room for 1.5 people. But it powered on and the nav systems responded. That was all they needed. Xena stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. Then, without turning, she said, "You should go first." Vincent frowned. "What are you talking about?" "There's only enough oxygen for one on long range," she said. "I can make it to the edge of the station's orbit manually. You take the pod, get off-world, deliver the rest of the data." He stepped beside her, heart pounding. "No, not happening." She looked at him then. "Vincent." "No," he said again, firmer this time. "We didn't come this far just for me to bail out and leave you behind like some noble sacrifice. We finished this together." Xena's jaw tensed. "That's not how Dravari see things. One survives to carry the memory." "I'm not Dravari," he snapped. "I'm human, and we don't leave the people we love behind." The silence that followed that word was sharp, not awkward, just real. Heavy. Xena didn't react right away, but after a moment she stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest again, that familiar gesture, the one that always meant more than words. "You love me?" she asked, voice quiet. He met her eyes. "I do." Xena blinked once, then leaned in and kissed him, not like before. This time it was slow, deliberate, full of meaning. When they parted, her expression had softened just slightly. "Then we make it fit," she said. They tore the rig apart, removed every non-essential panel, stripped the side compartments, gutted the secondary nav console. Between Xena's strength and Vincent's precision, they reshaped the inside until there was just enough room for both of them to squeeze in. Barely. It would be tight, miserable even, but it would work. That was enough. As they sealed the cockpit, the first tremor hit. The Crucible was falling now, slowly, steadily, imploding under its own systems. The AI hadn't lied. The station would self-neutralize, wipe all traces. Xena slid into the back of the rig, pressing against the rear wall to make space for him. Vincent climbed in front, strapped himself in, and reached back to hold her hand. She gripped it tight. The launch was rough, more like being thrown than flying, but they made it out. The escape rig shot from the dock and spun violently before stabilizing in the upper stratosphere. The Crucible loomed behind them, shrinking rapidly, its lights flickering, its surface fracturing. Then it was gone, swallowed in a silent explosion that rippled through the vacuum. Inside the pod, Vincent let out a long breath. Xena rested her forehead against the back of his shoulder, her body pressed against his in the cramped space. "We're free," he whispered. "No," she said, voice low. "Now we begin." And for the first time in years, he believed it. The stars stretched endlessly in every direction, quiet and cold, as the escape pod coasted on backup thrusters through uncharted space. The Crucible was gone now, Nothing left of the sprawling facility but dust, drifting debris, and a final data burst that had already spread across 3 relay beacons before the explosion had cut the last tether. Vincent watched from the viewport, silent, letting the weight of it sink in. It was over, not just the training, not just the mission, the whole damn machine. Every manipulation, every hidden program, every cruel test had ended with them. The Crucible's secrets were no longer secrets. The galaxy would know what they'd done, and there would be no dragging it back into the shadows. Behind him, Xena shifted, her arms wrapped loosely around his torso in the tight confines of the rig. The cramped space hadn't made things comfortable, but neither of them minded anymore. She breathed evenly against his back, her presence solid and grounding. And even now, after everything, they were still connected. More than ever. They hadn't said much since launching, but they didn't need to. What was left to explain? They had fought. They had bled. They had survived not as tools, not as data points, but as people. And more than that, as a pair. Vincent exhaled, slow and steady, then turned slightly, shifting so he could face her. She adjusted with him, careful not to slam her head into the metal plating, and rested her chin on his shoulder, her glowing eyes steady. "Think we'll get picked up?" he asked. Xena nodded once. "We will." The Crucible broadcast didn't just reach neutral space. It hit coalition relays. Someone will respond. He smirked. "Let's just hope it's not someone with another experiment in mind." Her expression didn't change, but she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his again. It wasn't just a Dravari ritual anymore. It had become something between them, comfort, truth, affection, all wrapped into one. "If they try," she said, "we'll remind them who they're dealing with." "I like that plan," Vincent said, his voice quieter now. "But I was thinking maybe once we land, we don't jump into another fight, not right away." Xena arched a brow. "You want rest?" He shook his head. "Not rest, just a different kind of life, one that isn't about bleeding every day to prove we matter." She was quiet for a moment, as if measuring the thought. "You think they'll let us live it?" "I think we've earned the right to try." Xena let that hang in the air for a beat, then nodded slowly. "Then we build it, on our terms." The pod systems blinked as it approached a civilian comm range. Vincent keyed in an open distress signal. Low priority, non-military, flagged as post-conflict extraction. No encryption, no aliases, just his name and hers and one line of truth. Survivors of a failed weapons program requesting asylum. Within 10 minutes, a response pinged back. A transport cruiser in orbit around a mining colony had picked up their signal. Human crew, civilian registry, headed to a neutral port city on the edge of the Western Drift. No questions asked. Pick up ETA, 45 minutes. Vincent leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, just for a moment. For the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel like prey. He didn't feel like a soldier or a subject or a broken thing looking for a second chance. He just felt like a man who'd endured something unspeakable and come out the other side with a woman who had become more than just a partner. Xena had become a part of him, not just in biology, not just in tactics, but in the quiet ways that mattered. Trust, presence, loyalty that didn't have to be shouted or proven anymore. She adjusted slightly beside him, draping one arm over his chest, resting against him like she belonged there. Not a warrior now, just a woman with fangs and scars and a soul sharp enough to cut steel. "When we land," she said, her voice low, "I want to find water. Real water, not filtration showers, not protein baths, a lake or an ocean." He smiled. "You want to swim?" "No," she said, "I want to float with you." It was a simple thing, but that was the point. After everything, after so much chaos and bloodshed and betrayal, the dream of something small, a quiet float under an alien sky, felt like the most precious thing in the world. He turned his head, kissed her temple, and said, "We'll find one. First planet we stop on, I'll find a body of water and drag you into it myself." She chuckled, a low rumble in her throat. "You couldn't drag me anywhere." "Then I'll persuade you." Strong words, passionate pleading, maybe a back massage. She tilted her head. "You offering?" "Not now," he said with a laugh, "but soon." They held each other in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the pod, the gentle clicks of stabilizers correcting their course. Outside, the stars kept drifting past, but they no longer felt distant or cold. They felt wide open, like the galaxy hadn't ended when the crucible burned. It had just begun. Vincent's fingers brushed along her hand, and Xena closed hers around his without hesitation. Theirs was not a fragile bond, not the kind that needed declarations every day to survive. It had been tested, tempered, forged in violence, and sharpened with mutual respect. It would endure not because of duty or need or desperation, but because they had chosen each other when it mattered most. When the transport cruiser arrived, they didn't scramble to meet it. They waited calmly, side by side, walking into the loading bay with shoulders squared, heads high. The crew didn't ask many questions. They gave them clean clothes, basic medical scans, and warm food. One of the doctors looked at Vincent's scan and paused, confused by the slight mutation in his muscle density, the elevated healing markers, the subtle alien markers in his genome. She asked if he'd been genetically enhanced. Vincent just smiled, something like that. They didn't stay on the cruiser long, just long enough to get their strength back, to sleep in real beds, to feel their feet on metal floors that didn't tremble with threat. When the cruiser docked on a quiet little moon orbiting a gas giant, they stepped off together, no longer fugitives, no longer targets, just two people. And they stayed. They found a lake. Xena floated. Vincent held her hand the whole time. And that was the end of their fight.